Hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. Today we're doing this Back to Basics webinar, which is designed to give you all a solid foundation, a good starting point for brand new users of KeyShot. Be also good for you as experienced users. There might be some things that we cover today that you might not have known before that will certainly help working in KeyShot and make it much easier for you. The first thing we're going to talk about today is directory structure. And the reason directory structure is important is because there are a lot of assets that go along with KeyShot scenes that make them function and make them work properly. And if you are transferring a scene to another computer or handing it off to another coworker, then it's important to understand how this directory structure works so that you can make sure all your scenes carry over properly. So on the PC side, if you go to the Documents folder, in there you will find a KeyShot folder. And inside you'll see environments, scenes, textures, renderings, materials, and backplates. And essentially this is where KeyShot by default will look for all these different elements. So if you create a scene on one computer that is dependent on a specific environment and you transfer it to another computer, you'll probably want to make sure that that specific environment is also placed in this folder. In here you also have your KeyShot 2.lic file. This is your license file, and this is what allows KeyShot to run properly. So it's important that you do keep your license file in this folder, otherwise KeyShot will not be able to run. The other thing I want to mention about the KeyShot resources folder, if you ever have problems with, say, saving renderings or something along those lines, a lot of times it comes down to permissions. And if I right-click on my KeyShot folder and go to Properties, under the Security tab, you'll want to make sure that you have full write permissions for whatever account that you're logged into and that you use to do your KeyShot work. I'll also show you where these locations are on the Mac and how to set permissions there. We go into this folder here. Okay, so I've got this KS Resources image. And on the Mac, you'll find KeyShot Resources in Library, Application Support, KeyShot. And you'll see the same directory structure there. Now, if you ever come across a point where maybe it won't install your license properly and KeyShot won't run, or renderings aren't saving, or materials aren't saving properly, you'll want to make sure, again, that you have proper permissions on this folder. So if you look at this screenshot here, if you right-click on the KeyShot folder and select Get Info, this dialog box will pop up. And near the bottom, you have something called Sharing and Permissions. You want to make sure that all this is set to read and write. Okay, so the next thing, let's talk about licensing for a second. As I mentioned, your KeyShot 2.lic lives in this folder, and that's what allows KeyShot to actually run. Now, one of the features of KeyShot 2 is that you have a license activate-deactivate feature, and this will allow you to transfer your license on up to 3 machines an unlimited number of times. And you can transfer your license on PC by going to the File menu and saying deactivate license on this computer. The next thing you'll want to do is go over to the machine you would like to transfer your license to, start KeyShot, fill out your information on the activation screen along with your serial code, and press activate. Since you've already deactivated on the original computer, the KeyShot activation should happen just fine on the new computer. If for whatever reason it can't connect to the server, you have issues, you can always select Create License Request File instead of pressing Activate. That will put a license request file on your desktop, and you can send that to support@luxion.com to get your license activated. And again, let's talk about doing this on the Mac as well. So on the Mac side, to deactivate your license, you'll want to go up to the KeyShot menu, select Deactivate License, and that will disable your license. Again, you do need to be connected to the internet during the deactivate process and the activate process. Once it's been activated on the new machine, you're free to unhook that machine from the internet and go anywhere you want, and your license should run just fine. Okay, let's talk about importing and working with your data. This is pretty much going to be the first place that you stop when you open up your KeyShot scene for the first time. You'll want to import your data to get rolling. So if you go to the import option and select your first model, go ahead and select this one here, and you're presented with some options. You have center geometry, snap to ground, and you have your orientation in which your model is actually created in. Different CAD applications have different axes for up. Once you know the axis for your particular CAD application, you just want to go ahead and set that, and you should never have to touch it again, and all your models should come in oriented properly. The other thing you have under Advanced is keep individual parts. If your material breakups are coming in not as broken up as you would like, you can always select this keep individual parts, and this will attempt to separate all the pieces of geometry that were created separate from each other so that you can assign individual materials to those. Okay, now the one thing about this center geometry and snap to ground is if you do have either of these checked, it's going to change the coordinates that your model was initially created in. And where that becomes important is if you're importing separate pieces of geometry that all fit together and you want them to come in the same location relative to each other. So for example, if you're working on a car, maybe you're importing the car body separately from the wheels. If you want the wheels to come in the correct location, you'll want to make sure that center geometry and snap to ground are not checked, because again, that resets the model's position in 3D space to something other than its original creation point, and then KeyShot doesn't know how to put the wheel in the correct spot in relation to the car, since the car's position has changed. So, and we'll go ahead and show that workflow as well. So press OK here, and this will bring in my first piece of geometry. So we have basics. And let's look at the original model here. So you can see this is how the model was originally created. And what we'll do is we'll import these other pieces, and you can see how they all come in the correct spot in relation to each other. Go ahead and press import, and I'll import this too. Now, the second time you import something, you have a different dialog box that pops up. And this is because since you've imported a model, things are a little bit different. For example, do you want to completely overwrite the model that you currently have loaded, or do you want to add it to the scene? By default, add to scene is automatically checked. If you want to clear out your scene and start fresh, you can uncheck this. Retain materials. This is useful for whenever you're making changes to your designs, your models. Say, for example, I'm working on this 3D model of the word basics. Maybe for whatever reason I want to add another letter, another symbol to it. But I've already got all my materials assigned, and I'm happy with the material assignment. I don't necessarily want to have to go back in and reassign all those materials again. I mean, you've already done the work once, and why would you want to do it twice? So, if I added a new piece of geometry to this word basics, I re-import it and replace the model, I can select retain materials, and all the materials that were already pre-assigned with materials will come in just as they were. The only thing that will not have materials assigned to it is the new geometry that you add. Center geometry and snap to ground, those are the same. The coordinate system, if you are trying to import models that were created to work together, you'll want to make sure that your coordinates are set to from previous import, because it will look at the coordinate space that the original model was in. And if you have something else that goes along with it, it will retain that same coordinate space, and your model will come in the proper location. And again, you have your orientation X, Y, or Z. So there it is, came in just fine. Let's import the other piece of geometry, import back. And let's import the last piece. Select add to scene. And as you can see, everything came in its proper location, as it was in the modeling application. Okay, next thing to talk about here is how do we actually navigate our scene. There's a difference between moving the model and actually moving your camera. Some new users come in and start moving models around, or when they move their camera, they think they're actually moving the model. And to move your camera, if you left click and drag in the scene, this is essentially just orbiting your camera. If you want to dolly your camera, if you hold Alt and press right mouse and drag left and right, this will dolly your camera in and out. On the Mac, the key will be Option, right mouse, and drag left and right. If you want to pan your camera, you hold Alt, press down on the middle mouse wheel, and this is panning your camera. And as I mentioned, there's a big difference between dolly and zoom. And the difference is, imagine you have your point and shoot camera and you're taking pictures. If you actually physically walk with that camera up closer to your subject and take the picture, that's different than if you stand in the same spot and use your zoom function to actually zoom in on the subject. And that's the main difference there. So if we pull up the camera tab by pushing the Options button, you'll see in here we have focal length, and focal length is going to be your zoom. A higher value is a longer zoom lens. A lower value is a more of a wide angle lens. And with the wider angle lens, you'll get a lot more of an exaggerated perspective. With a zoom lens, your perspective will flatten out. And it'll appear that you're getting closer to the model, but again, the camera's position in 3D space is staying the same. It's your zoom lens that's changing. And one thing that's good to note about that is if you are, say, designing a small product, more often than not, something that is small, the camera is positioned far back from it, and the photographer will actually zoom in to photograph it. So that's something that's good to know if, like I said, if you're doing a small product. Okay, the other thing I want to talk about is saving your views. So say that you have a presentation that you're going to give to a client, and you know there's certain features on your model that you definitely want to highlight. There's features of your design that are important for convincing your client about how well you've done your job. So what you can do is you can position your camera on one of those spots, and maybe you want your focal length to be a little bit more wide angle, exaggerate the perspective a bit, and if you save your view, you're given this dialog box, and I'll call this view 1, save it out, and we'll go around to the top here, and for this one I'll create more of a zoom lens, which, by the way, other than using the slider, you can hold Alt on the PC or Option on the Mac, and if you middle mouse wheel backwards, that will increase your focal length. In other words, giving you a zoom lens. If you middle mouse wheel forward while holding Alt on the PC or Option on the Mac, that will decrease your focal length and give you more of a wide angle. So, but when I'm happy with my view, I can save the view, call this view 2. And the next time I move my camera around, change my focal length. At any point in time, I can go to the View menu, select my drop-down list, and select View 1. That puts all my camera settings that I had saved right back, and the camera in the same position. View 2, same thing. And the moment you move around, your views are retained, and you can continue to save other views or just work within your scene. Okay, the next thing I want to talk about is actually working with materials. Now, probably a good place to start for most of you when you're looking to start making your models look realistic is to pull up the material library. So right along the bottom, if you select materials, this will pull up your library. And in this case, we'll go ahead and go to Paints. And what you can do is drag and drop a material from the library, and if you hover over a part, it will give you a preview of where that material will actually be assigned. And KeyShot will not assign that material until you actually let go of the left mouse. Now, one thing to note is, more than likely, materials won't be exactly what you need for your project, but the beauty of KeyShot is the fact that you can make your material edits and changes and see the result on the fly. So there's not a whole lot of guesswork there. You change a parameter and what you see is what you get. And to start editing material, if you double click a part on the model, this pulls up the properties. So what I'll do here is, edit the color of the metallic paint here to more closely match the KeyShot blue. And also I'll drop the roughness all the way down because I want this to be a nice polished surface. Okay. Now the metallic paint works off of two colors. You have a base and you have a metal color. More often than not, the base is going to be a darker version of whatever color you're trying to create. And you can control the level of influence that the metal color actually has by using the metal coverage slider. And if you go all the way down, you end up with a flat paint. The metal no longer has any influence, and then the only color you have that's creating the look of this material is the base. And the next thing, if I double click on one of these materials and try to edit them, you'll notice it only affects one of them. What if I want those to both be linked in such a way that when I edit them, I only have to edit one material at a time? I can press Shift left click on the first material up here on this back, and I can right click down here on the basics and say link material. Now if I go and edit the color of either one of these, they're both affected. And I do know that these other parts on the model are going to have the same material. So again, I'll Shift left click on the back. I'll right click on this bar down here and say link material. And the same for this ring. Okay. Now, the next thing I want to talk about really quick is labels. A lot of you might have logos and things that need to go on your products or designs, and we have a very quick and easy way to add things like that. I'll start with this bar down here. I'll double click. So that pulls up the material properties, and I will go over to labels and I'll click add. And you can load in just about any image type, all the common formats: JPEG, TIFF, PNG, Targa. In this case I have a PNG, and the reason I have a PNG is because I have transparent edges. I don't want a square frame around my image. I want essentially just the two to show up. So once it's assigned to your material, you can click position, and as you click on the model, you can move the position of that image around. And I can scale it using the slider values here. And I can control the angle. Okay. Now the nice thing about this is if you wanted to have this label go across, say, a curved surface, if you're in this normal projection mode, that will actually allow you to do that. So if I click, and let's position it up there, and let's look around, and you can see it actually wrapping around the edge here. And that's because we are in this normal projection mode. 9 times out of 10, that's the mode you'll want to use. So just to keep things simple, I think this will work in most cases for you guys. Okay, let's adjust our angle a little bit to get that straight. And if you wanted to shift the position using slider values instead of clicking directly on there, you can certainly do that as well. Okay. All right. One other thing I do want to mention about labels, and I'll probably have to switch out my environment to illustrate this to you, is that you can apply specular highlights to those. So under your label properties, there's a specular value. If I set this to a color of white, I will actually get reflections on the labels. Otherwise, without that value set to white, if it's set to black, you're not going to see any reflections as they are cast across that label. Let's try and position our lighting here in such a way that you can see a reflection. Okay. And let's zoom in here and take a look. So you can see, let me actually try and boost the intensity of this a little bit. Okay, so if you look at this white specular highlight cutting across the metallic paint here, you can see when it does come across the two, it does actually brighten up that label a little bit. If I turn that specular color all the way down, notice it's not affected, and it's essentially becoming a matte type material. So if you do want specular highlights and reflections to affect your labels, this is where you actually control that. Okay. I'm going to do another method of placing the two on here, and in this case what we're going to do is we're going to use a texture. So what I'll do is I'll just disable the label by unchecking this enable box, and under the texture box I'll go ahead and check load, and we'll use this 2.png. Okay, first thing you'll notice is that it is projected all over the place across this model. I do only want 1, 2 on here. So what I can do is uncheck repeat. And let me set this to different mapping mode. All right, appears we have a small bug here. It looks like the repeat option is not being disabled when materials are linked. So if you do come across that, if you unlink your materials, that should work for you. But the benefit to actually using this as a texture is it will actually take on the material properties that you have on your material. So this too is actually getting some of that metallic look. And the other thing that it will do for you is if you do have bump maps applied, so let's go ahead and select a bump map here. Your bump map will actually influence your label or your texture. If you don't have bump map, or if you don't have your label applied as a texture, then your bump map will not influence it. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the HDRI lighting. And this is one of the things that makes KeyShot so easy to use. And HDRI Lighting is basically, it's all image-based, and if you look at your scenes and you zoom all the way out, you'll notice that there's a sphere that your scene is contained in. And on the inside of that sphere, you have an image that's actually mapped to it. And because you're not having to actually set up physical lights and you do get a fully contained environment, it makes it very easy to create realistic 3D lighting. And whenever you want to switch out environments, you can choose from some of the ones that we have in the library. If you go under the download section of our site, you'll see other environments that are available to you. But let's go ahead and drag and drop a new environment into the interface. And you can see that changes your lighting right away. If you want to brighten up your environment, you can do so by pressing the up arrows, and that will increase the brightness of your environment. You can also do it under the Environment tab by adjusting this brightness value. And if you don't want to see your environment, you can uncheck Show Environment. And you can also set a background color. Also under the Environment tab, you have the ability to turn on ground reflections. And one of the nice things about these HDRI environments is that you can control the rotation of them. So under here, if you select rotation and move that slider, it will actually orbit that sphere that I showed you earlier, and it will change how the lighting actually falls across your model. So if you're trying to position reflections and accentuate edges and forms in your design, that's a good method to go about doing that. You can also use this height parameter, and that will adjust the environment height and again give you more control over positioning the reflections and things across your model. In this case, I'll actually go back to a studio environment. And a lot of times, for products, you'll find the studio lighting environments are mostly going to be what you're going to want to use. Okay, there's another thing that you can do if you want to adjust reflections a little bit more or have a little bit greater control, and that's import another piece of geometry and make it an emissive material. So I'll go ahead and go back to my import menu here, and I'll import this ground plane. Again, we'll add to scene, and now we have this plane in the scene. What I'll do is I'll first scale it down because it came in way too big, so I'll right click on it, select Scale Object, and if we scale this down, get something that's a little more reasonable to work with. Okay, so now what I'm going to want to do is I'll double click this, and I'm going to change the material type from advanced over to emissive. And I'll increase the brightness of the color so we get something that's white. And the next thing I'm going to want to do is actually uncheck this visible to eye. So we turn that off. That hides its visibility. And I do know the plane is still here, so if I right click on it and say Move Object, I can still manipulate its position. And you'll see what I'm getting at here as soon as I turn up this intensity. So I can actually still position this plane and control how the reflections fall across it. If I want to angle it, I can grab the rotation parameter there and do that. If I really want to brighten this up, I can crank that intensity slider. And you also have the ability to uncheck visible in reflections. But if you do have a reflective object, probably makes sense to leave that on if you do want it to influence that. I'll show you one other interesting little trick for that. I'll just create a very simple texture here. Actually, I think we have some in the KeyShot Resources folder that we can use. So you can apply textures to your emissive materials. If they have color in them, whatever color your texture that you map to it will be projected out as actual light color. So let's find something with some color here. see what we got. We'll use this yellow here. So you can see now it's taken on that yellow color. But one of the things I find useful, though, is something simple, even like diagonal lines. And you can control the scale of these. So you see you can get, these vertical lines cutting across there. You can control the intensity of the texture as well. And you can also control the rotation of these lines. So this will give you a little bit more of a precise method of controlling textures and how they look on your models. We'll go ahead and delete this, though. And again, I do know it's still there. So if I right-click up here and say delete part, that will get rid of my emissive plane. Okay, the next thing I want to talk about is backplates. So a backplate works separate. It works in conjunction with the environment, but it actually has no effect on your lighting. Your lighting is always going to be derived from whatever environment image you have loaded. Okay. If I go to my options box and go to backplates, I can load in one. And basically all common image file formats are supported. So I do have this backplate that I already created. And my lighting has not changed. The only thing that's changed is the background image here. And so you can freely position your model inside this backplate and composite it into this image in real time. And if I want to, again, control the lighting and reflections on the model, I can still rotate that environment the way we were doing before. And the best way to go about this is to use the Control and left click, or Command on the Mac and left click, and drag. And what I'm doing is I'm orbiting that environment sphere so that maybe I want a highlight hitting this side of the model. I can certainly do that. And you can still, of course, adjust environment height. There is no shortcut key for that at the moment. I'm sure we will add one for KeyShot 3, but you can control it using the slider values here. And the other thing I do want to point out is, you see how I do have these dark shadows on the ground? Maybe I wanted to brighten those up a bit. I can do so by checking this ground indirect illumination. And what that means is light will hit this 3D model and bounce onto the ground, and essentially you have all these secondary bounces of light occurring, which you do have in everyday life. So if I check this, you'll notice that the shadows should brighten up a little bit. So you see we do get some extra light actually bouncing down there on the ground. And the exchange of light occurs between the ground and the model. So it's not just one way. It's not like you have light hitting the model, then the ground. You have light hitting the model, the ground, and then other parts of the model. And it should give you a more realistic result. But if you find that it brightens your shadows up too much and you're not happy with that, you can always turn it off. Okay, the next thing I want to talk about is rendering an output. So when you are ready to render your image, you can go here under the Render tab. The other option you have is to save out a screenshot. And one thing I definitely want to emphasize is that when you are working in KeyShot, I mean, you are seeing full quality, full 3D rendering. A lot of times we get the question, okay, so when do you actually render? Well, it's actually always rendering until you press Shift-P and pause it. It's always working in the background. So what a lot of people do, especially in the interest of time, I mean, a lot of times they need a very quick image, something that they can show to their boss or members of their team and try and communicate an idea very quickly. You can let it sit for a second, press screenshot, and that will save out a view of your current scene. If you are doing a render for production work and you do want some higher quality, you can go over to the Render tab and you can select from different image file formats. We support JPEG, TIFF, EXR and TIFF32. EXR and TIFF32 are 32-bit images, and we do have other webinars that discuss how 32-bit images actually benefit you. So again, if you go to the webinars section of our website, you can view all of our past webinars, and they will explain a lot of these concepts in a little bit more depth and detail. Now I can actually, I will set this to TIFF, and TIFF is going to be uncompressed. JPEG is going to be compressed. So if you are outputting images, my recommendation would be to at least do TIFF. You might not need the 32-bit output, but I do suggest working with uncompressed images. The other option you'll have here is this option to include alpha. And I'll show you what an alpha channel does and how that will actually benefit you. And let's go ahead and render this out really quick. I'll drop the image size down so we get a pretty fast render here. So we do have include alpha selected, and we'll call this basics. And I'll just place this directly on the desktop. While that does render, I'll just go ahead and tell you a little bit about alpha channels and why they help. An alpha channel is basically going to create a stencil that you can use to cut your 3D model out from the background. So it will give you, some greater flexibility in switching out your backgrounds or editing your 3D render itself independent from the background. All right, so it looks like our render is done. When your render is complete, you'll want to just click close, and that will save your image out to wherever you told it to go. Good thing to do whenever you are switching between applications. If you're working in KeyShot and you need to go back to your CAD application or Photoshop, I always suggest pausing your interface. One thing I want to point out is KeyShot is entirely CPU based, and it will use all of the threads in your machine at a very high level. On some of the lower core machines, 4 cores, 8 cores, dual cores, you should see it at 100% of your thread utilization whenever KeyShot is running. Until you actually press Shift-P, then all the activity does drop off on the cores, and you free up your system resources to go do some other work. So here in Photoshop, I'll open up our image that we saved really quick, and you'll notice right away that we do have transparency here. Go to my layers, you can see we do have one layer, and of course that checker background indicates that we have transparency. Now whenever you do render with an alpha channel and you pull your image into Photoshop, you will have to do one additional step to get your background. So if you go to Layer, Layer Mask, and then select From Transparency, you'll see right here in your Layers palette that now you have this black and white image here, and that's your alpha channel. That's going to be your layer mask. If I right-click on it and disable, it's no longer affecting the image, and you see your background. Now, how it works is anything that's black in this image is basically indicated as it's transparent. Anything that's white is completely opaque. If you Control-click it, what it will do is it will automatically select your alpha channel, so you can select your 3D geometry. I'll disable this layer mask again, and let me show you what you can do once it is selected. I'll press Control-J to duplicate my 3D geometry, and I'm keeping the background separate. So if I move the 3D geometry, you can see it is actually independent from the background. Your reflections do carry over as well. And if I go back to my background layer, I can go to Image Adjustments, Hue Saturation, and change this color to anything I want. So as you can see, rendering with an alpha channel just gives you an extra level of control and flexibility. Same as I can change the color on the background, I can do it to the 3D geometry as well. So if you need to do any color correction to anything that you've rendered, this is a good workflow to actually give yourself that flexibility. Okay, one other really important thing that I want to touch on before we go into the KeyShot 3 preview is when you are working with transparent materials in real time. So what I'll do, I want to disable some settings here in the real-time tab, and we'll quickly finish assigning materials to the rest of this model. So if I am happy with a material, I can press Shift left click, Shift right to paste. So we'll get metal on there. And we'll make this material here on top of the KeyShot lens, we'll make that glass. So I'll double click there, and I'll set it to solid glass. Looks like I'm missing a blade back there. And if I want to access any of the materials behind here, I can do so by right-clicking in Hiding Part. If you right-click and Show All Parts, that will bring back anything that's hidden. So we'll just copy and paste this blue metallic paint back here, and let's show all parts. Now, this is what I want to show you guys. I mean, you see how dark it is back there? If you right-click on if you click in the Real-Time tab, the reason it's dark is because this Detailed Indirect Illumination option is disabled. As soon as you enable that, that will allow enough light to pass through there to actually create, a realistic render. It will be disabled by default simply for performance reasons. And while you're working, it's certainly an option that you can keep off to improve your performance. So, but we do get questions from time to time. Hey, I have these objects that are under glass and it's really dark. Why is it dark? And this is why. But one other thing I want to point out is when you actually do go to render your image, this detailed indirect illumination is always enabled. So even if it's off in the real-time tab, it will be turned on and you will have realistic light bouncing below your material. Okay, so that pretty much wraps up the first portion of the webinar, talking about the basics of working in KeyShot. Hopefully that helped give you a decent foundation and explain some fundamentals for you guys. And I'll go ahead and close this scene, and let's take a look at KeyShot 3. Right, one thing I do want to emphasize is this is just an early preview. We are still in the alpha phase of development, so things are far from complete, but you can get an idea of where we're headed and how we see this animation and KeyShot 3 actually working. So start KeyShot 3 here, and the user interface is slightly different. It's certainly not final yet. We are doing plenty more work on it. But let me go ahead and open up a file here that I already have. And I'll open up this gyro.bip. Okay. So one of the things that you can do in KeyShot 3 now is you can move individual parts. I'm sure most of you in the past have tried moving individual parts, and you notice that all you can do is move a model as a whole. If you right-click on a part and you say Move Part, you'll get your Translate manipulator, and you can actually move a part independently. So if you are trying to do exploded view renders of your models, you no longer have to move all the parts out in your CAD application, re-export a new model, and do it that way. You can actually interactively position parts inside KeyShot. The other thing you can do is you can scale, and also our Translate manipulator has all the functions stored in here as small buttons underneath it. So if I want to go into rotate mode, I can do that. Also, you'll notice that the rotate widget actually orbits with the geometry now. So if I rotate on the z-axis, for example, I have a pretty good understanding of what I'm going to get when I do that. Okay, when you're happy with the placement of your geometry, you can close this out. Let's take a look at some texturing abilities now. So I just double-clicked on that glass material, and I'll change this to something simple, just the diffuse, and we'll apply a texture to this. You'll notice that the material tab is a bit different. We've condensed things, we've worked on making our usage of space more efficient. Let's go ahead and load in a texture. Let's just load in this camo. And I'll set this to box map. Okay. Now, in the past, you could always use the scale slider to adjust your scale. But now we will have the ability to use this interactive mapping tool. So if I click on that, I can control the position of the texture using the arrows. And all this will be refined for final release. We actually just got this functionality the other day, so we're still doing a lot of polish on it. You can rotate your texture. You can scale it. So your manipulator that functions for your move widget will also function the same way for your textures. And again, when you're happy with your placement, you can close it out. Go ahead and disable this texture. Actually, one thing I want to show you also, you do have this blend with color. So if I wanted to mix this texture with another color, you can do that as well. And as soon as you're done with that, you can disable that, and you do have the ability to adjust your texture brightness. Okay, so let's change this back to a solid glass. And the other thing we can do is apply alpha maps. And what alpha maps are going to do is essentially cut out areas in your material that will appear as transparent. So a good thing for that would be like speaker mesh. So I'll actually switch this back, and under your texture tab you have an option called opacity. So if we click on opacity and load a texture, let's find one that we have here. Okay, I have this mesh alpha. Okay, and this mesh alpha essentially has an alpha channel applied to it, and that alpha channel is interpreted as areas that are going to be transparent. You can also use maps that have black and white values. So for example, let's use this diagonal lines, and what I have to do then is set this opacity mode from alpha, because it was using the alpha channel, to color. And if we change the mapping type on this, this should make a little bit more sense. Okay, and again, you can control the scale of this. And this will be an interesting test. Let's see if the mapping tool is working. As I mentioned, we just got this the other day. So yeah, it needs to be hooked up for opacity. So still working on that. Okay, the next thing, let's talk about the animation system and how that's actually going to work and how that's turning out. Okay, so when you do want to animate your models, you'll need a couple things. You want to open up the timeline. Okay, and for the current state of KeyShot 3 Alpha, we will need the project window open. And the project window, if I click here, this is where your scene tree is stored. So I can see my model hierarchy in here, and I can select parts. If I select a part in the scene tree, it will be highlighted in the real-time view. And if I want to apply an animation to any one of these parts, I can do so by right-clicking on the part and say Add Animation. I'll just select Rotation. And if I click that rotation option there, you can see the animation parameters down here. The rotation is also added to the timeline. If I want to change the name of the rotation, I can do that. Call this outer ring rotation. And what I'll do, is I need to adjust where my pivot point is. At the moment, we don't have pivot point visualization hooked up, but it certainly will be hooked up in the final release so that you guys can visualize where your pivot points are, and you'll also be able to manipulate them as well. But if I move my time slider here, you should be able to see some animation. I know it looks like you're not, but the reason is because it's orbiting on the x-axis. If I change the axis to y, then you can see how the animation is actually being applied. Okay, now the next thing I can do is I can increase my degrees of rotation. Maybe I want it to be 720 degrees. That changes, how many degrees it's actually rotated. Now what if I wanted to extend the duration of this? It's real easy. You can grab your layer here in the timeline, your outer ring rotation. You can simply extend that, and that will change the duration that 720 degrees occurs. Okay. Maybe I'm happy with this animation and I want to copy and paste it to another part. I can right click on it, say copy animation, select another part in the scene tree, paste animation, and now I have both of them orbiting together. But maybe I want this pasted animation to orbit around a different axis. I can change that to Z, and now they're orbiting separately. They're on different axes. Maybe I want the second animation to not take as long. I can scale it down in the timeline, and it will occur faster. Maybe I want it to occur at a different point in time. I can drag it down, and it will actually occur later on in time. So you can see there's the first animation, and now the second one starts. Now maybe I want to move the model as a whole with these animations actually rotating. If I right-click on the top level in the hierarchy, I can select Add Animation, do a translation, and you can set your translation values. Okay, and again, here's your translation animation. Maybe I want it to take a little bit longer, and maybe I don't want it on the y-axis. Maybe I want it on the x. You can set it there. So you'll notice that these rings orbit just fine. They stay around the model, and the translation actually occurs along with it. So, like I said, that's just a very quick introduction of how the animation system is shaping out so far. One thing I do want to emphasize, you'll notice that I did all my work applying animations within the scene tree. For the final release, we will be making it interactive. So there'll be a lot more interaction with the model and adding animations that way as opposed to doing it in the scene tree. But of course, you will be able to do it in the scene tree as well. The nice thing about KeyShot is all your CAD hierarchy will be retained. So for example, if you have a car door and that's all one assembly, you can add an animation to that whole assembly and that whole door will move as one. And then if you want to add animations to the individual parts on the door, you can do that as well. And they will actually carry along with the overall door animation. So yeah, I think we'll stick around for a little while to answer any questions that you may have. I know Jeff's been answering plenty as we've been going along here. But now's your time to ask any questions and provide any feedback. If there's any webinars you'd like to see in the future, you're more than welcome to make suggestions, and we'd be happy to do so. How are we looking on questions, Jeff?
Do you want to show how you made your blue backplate?
The blue backplate?
Yeah, it's just a pretty simple gradient.
Yeah. Okay, so one of the questions was how did you make your blue backplate? And yeah, I'll go ahead and show that in Photoshop really quick. It's actually very, very easy. And one of the things that's nice about it, it's a very simple abstract backplate. And if you're designing a product for a company and they have specific colors, which most companies do, you can sort of brand your designs, what you're designing, and focus it towards your client. And I'm sure they will like to see that you have an understanding of who their company is. And that's one way you can certainly do that. So inside Photoshop, I'll go to File, New, and we'll do 1920 by 1080. I'll press OK. And here's what we'll do. We'll go to Layers. And I always like to work in layers to make sure I, am able to edit things whenever I want. So we have our background layer. I'll create a new layer. What I'll do is just create a simple gradient. This will be black and white, and I'm going to use a radial gradient here. Okay, and what I'll do is I will increase my window size so I can see the edges of the image here, and I'm going to press Control T to essentially transform this, and I'm going to scale it up. Actually, one thing I'm going to do before I do that is duplicate it. So I need two of these. So I'm on the top layer. I pressed Control T. You can also access Control T by going to Edit, Free Transform. And what I'm going to do is just scale this down. And this will simulate sort of a spotlight on the ground. So it's kind of nice if you want to place a product or a design in the center of one of these. That'll work out nice for you. And I'll increase it so that I have more area occupying the bright portion. Okay. And the next thing I'll do is also increase the background image a little bit so we have more of that gradient going on. Okay. And what I'll do, instead of applying color transformations to these layers directly, again, I want to give myself full flexibility, so what I'll do is go to Layer, New, and select a new adjustment layer, and we'll do Hue Saturation. Press OK. And if I pull up the material property, or the properties of this, okay, I have my adjustments here. I can select Colorize. I can increase the brightness. I can adjust the hue, saturation, all of these. I can do the same if I wanted to control levels. I close this out and go to Layer, New Adjustment Layer, and go to Levels. We can increase or reduce contrast. And if you wanted to, say, soften out this edge here, I can apply a layer mask to the ground portion by clicking this layer mask button. And what that's going to do is this creates that alpha channel that we were talking about earlier. So if I go to my brush and I start to paint black on this layer mask, it's actually going to erase some of those pixels. So you can get a smoother blend between your backplate there. And of course, you spend a little more time than I just did. You can get this looking pretty good. Obviously, I think the white is a bit extreme in this version, but spend some time with it, and it's a good way to give yourself an interesting background. And the nice thing about these abstract backgrounds is most of the studio lighting environments will look really good with these. So, any more questions, Jeff?
Let's see here. The difference between the offline and real-time render.
Okay, good question. One of the questions is, what's the difference between offline and real-time render? Go ahead and close KeyShot 3 here, and I'll show you this in KeyShot 2. And we'll just open up a scene here. We'll just go with one of the default ones. Okay, we have this wine glass. And the difference between offline and real-time. So many of you might have noticed that in the render options, you have the option to use this real-time render. And what that's going to do is that's going to take all the settings that you have essentially in your real-time tab. So whatever's making your image look the way it does here in the interface, it's going to take all those settings and it's going to apply them to your final render. So what that can do for you is that can save a little bit of confusion with render settings. You notice when you have used real-time render enabled, if you go into the quality tab, all you get is max number of frames and max render time in seconds. Max number of frames, if you press H in your real-time window, this pulls up your frames per second. So in this case, I'm getting 202 frames per second. So when this reaches 256 frames, my render will be complete. The other option you have is to use max render time in seconds. This is really nice just because if you know you've got a deadline and you know you have a certain amount of time to get something out, you can set your max render time in seconds and it will give you the best quality image that it can within that amount of time. And certainly for KeyShot 3 we are improving this. The time, it will no longer be just only in seconds. You'll have more options, hours, minutes, things like that. But one other thing to note, when you are deciding between use real-time and use offline, if you are doing a very, very large render, the real-time render does not have as much capability in terms of memory usage. If you're doing a very large render, I would suggest going with the offline render to output that file. So, and you'll notice the difference too when you actually render these. So if I set use real-time render and let's set our max render time in seconds, let's do 100, press render. The render window looks a little bit different. You don't have that initial block-in phase where it goes through and you see this rough image start to create itself. It basically reses up the same exact way that you guys are used to when you're working in the real-time mode. The other nice thing about it is, what you can do is you can also set your render time for much longer than you need. You could set this for 10,000 seconds or 5,000 seconds, and when you go and press stop, your image still saves out. So it's nice in that sense that you always will have a final image. If you run out of time, you press stop, your image still saves out. How are we doing on questions?
And then the basics of the offline render settings, like samples.
Okay, all right. Okay, so the basics of the offline render settings. All right. So go ahead and go over those. It's definitely a good thing to understand. I think one of the biggest problems that newer users come across is when they come in here under the quality tab, they're like, well, I don't want a low quality image, I want a high quality, so I need to do this, and start cranking all these. And it's perfectly understandable, but if you have a better understanding of what these do, you can tune these more efficiently. So let's go through and explain what all these are and what they do. So samples, where this is going to come into play, this is mostly when you have rough materials. So let me change this solid glass type over to a metal, and I'll add a bit of roughness to it. Okay, now you'll notice that when you have roughness applied, there's this glossy samples setting, and this is essentially the samples on that rough material. If you go down, you have lower sample setting. Basically, fewer rays are being shot out from each pixel in the image, and you're going to get a less accurate result. And you'll notice that rough materials will be noisier whenever you have low sample settings. If you start to increase this, it will increase the amount of rays that are shot out from each pixel, and it will start to smooth out your result. So really the thing to take from this is the only benefit you really get from using more samples is when you have rough materials. If you have a scene that's perfectly polished, perfectly reflective, you can get away with using a low sample number like 8. Generally, I wouldn't go below 8. I mean, you still are important for the reflective materials, but I mean, more so, you really need to turn up these samples on your rough materials. But the nice thing about this glossy sample setting is that you can set your samples per material. So if I have one rough material in my scene, I can set that material to 32, and the whole scene will get rendered at 8 if I have it set to 8 in the render options, and only that rough material will be rendered at 32. So it's a very efficient way to concentrate the samples and the rendering power where it's actually needed. Okay, let's take a look at ray bounces. Okay, I'll change this back to solid glass. Ray bounces are important whenever you have reflective or transparent objects. The nice thing about them is you can tune them in real time, and that will give you an accurate representation, of what you need when you output your file. So if I turn this all the way down, let's take a look at what's happening here. If we go to one bounce, all we have is a ray of light hitting the surface of this and then coming back to the camera. So you only have one bounce there. If you go from 1 to 2, you're allowing another bounce to occur, so you'll actually get some transparency. Go 2 to 3, you get more. Let's go 5, 6. And the nice thing about this, like I said, you can tune this in real time. So if you go from a value of 7 to 8 and you don't notice an improvement, you know that you don't need any more than 8 ray bounces. It will mostly come into play, like I said, transparent or reflective objects. The more complex transparent and reflective objects, say like a headlight enclosure, you'll need more. Probably a value of around 12 to 16. Things like diamonds, you'll definitely want to use more ray bounces. But again, always check here in real time, how many ray bounces you need to actually make your render look good, and then set that same value over here under the Quality tab. Anti-aliasing, the fact that computer-generated images are made up of pixels, or all images in the computer are made up of pixels for that matter, and we all know that pixels are square. So what can happen if you don't use anti-aliasing is you can see a stair-stepped effect around edges. What anti-aliasing does is it tries to average out colors and intensities in pixels that are surrounding each other. That way you can actually smooth out your edges a bit. Generally, you probably wouldn't need a value much beyond 2 or 3 to get a decent looking image. The other thing to point out is if you're doing a very high-res render, the fact that it's so large is anti-aliasing in itself, because edges are made up of a whole bunch of pixels. You probably only need a value of 1 for doing very large images. Shadow quality. This is going to control the quality of the shadow on the ground. If I increase this, if I increase it in real time, you'll be able to see the effect that it has. If I go down to 1, notice around here, around the edge of the glass, where it makes contact with the ground, you see this chunky square-like shadow happening. If you increase your shadow quality, that will actually start to refine itself. And you notice you get a better shadow with sharper definition in it. Again, this is one of those settings that, like ray bounces, you can tune this in real time. So if I know this value of 3 is good for me, when I come back over here to the Shadow Quality tab, I can set it to 3, and I know that's all I need. One thing I do want to point out, though, about shadow quality is the ground shadows are actually projected across a ground plane that is made up of a grid. And this grid is where you actually see these squares. So these squares are essentially one grid square, and that grid square has shading information about the density of a shadow. Now, one thing you can do before you go increasing your shadow quality is under the Environment tab, if you go to this ground size option, you can start to reduce this. So I have the same amount of grid squares, but composed in a smaller overall square, so that you pack more of those little grid squares into a smaller area, so you get a better, sharper defined shadow without actually having to increase your shadow quality. The thing to watch out for, though, is you see out here how we have this shadow clipping. That's because our ground size got too small. So you can see as I adjust this, you can see where that ground plane actually ends. So, I mean, it'll be something you want to balance. Make sure that it's just big enough that you don't clip your shadows, but no larger than it has to be, so that you don't have to increase your shadow quality very much. Okay, global illumination quality. Now let's talk a little bit about global illumination. I'll import another piece of geometry here. Okay, so we have this ground plane. Okay. And what I'll do is I'll make the outside of this glass just a diffuse material. And let me get a studio environment. And I'll make this diffuse material red. And this ground plane down here is going to be, just leave that as that simple gray. Okay. Yeah, also actually rotate this object. Okay. So global illumination quality is the quality of the light that's bounced around your scene. it's all the secondary bounces. So when you have a direct light source hitting a surface, basically you have all this color and shading and intensity information that light actually picks up, and then when it bounces off to another surface, it transfers that information to there, and you have all this exchange of light, and this is the way light actually behaves in the real world. So what this global illumination is going to do is control the quality of that indirect lighting. So if we turn it off in real time, notice, I mean, this isn't nearly as realistic as we had before. You know, you need that color bleeding to actually create a realistic look. Actually, but the thing about this is there isn't really a value that you can set in real time to determine how much you need. So it's one of those things that, you know, I can give you some good advice about what your global illumination quality setting should be. For the most part, you shouldn't need anything really beyond 1. If you go to 2 or 3, you might see some improved self-shadowing on the models. If you are using, say, diffuse materials, something that's not highly reflective, and you see a little bit of chunkiness in the shadows, then yeah, you might want to increase your global illumination quality. You shouldn't hardly ever need a value above 3, though. And one thing to know is it definitely will increase your render time. So whenever you can get away with using a value of 1, then I certainly suggest doing that. And 9 times out of 10, the value of 1 should work for you. Okay. Pixel filter size, this applies a slight blur to your image. A lot of times with computer-generated images, the thing that makes them look fake is the fact that they are too perfect. So what this will do, like I said, it will apply a slight blur. So if you find your images are too sharp, you can always increase this, or you can save it for Photoshop and do it there. And the thing about this is once you apply it to your image, it's set and there's no going back once your render is completed. DOF quality, this stands for depth of field. And depth of field is a technique in photography. Essentially, photographers can focus on an area and have the background or foreground blurred out. You know, and you can do the same thing in KeyShot. So if I go under the camera tab, under here we have depth of field. If I check that and pick the focus point, I can focus on a certain area. Now if I lower my f-stop here, that will increase the effect of that blurred area. Increasing it decreases the effect of the blur. And whenever you want to pick your focus point, you can always do it interactively by selecting Pick Focus, clicking on your model, and then selecting Done. Okay, so the only time that this DOF quality, or this depth of field quality, is going to come into play is when you actually have it enabled. If it's not enabled, then you don't need to worry about this. I will tell you a value of 1 will definitely give you some noise in your blurred areas. I find that for production, you pretty much need a value of, I'd say, 2.5 to 3 or above to get a good looking image. Okay, sharp shadows. Sharp shadows are pretty much exactly what they say. If you have a very intense small light source in your scene and it is casting a sharp shadow, say for example like the sun, maybe I have a car that's in a outdoor environment with an outdoor backplate and the sun is low, so I have shadows being cast across the car body from the rear view mirror. If you don't have sharp shadows enabled, the shadow that's cast across the 3D geometry could look blurry and undefined. When you have sharp shadows enabled, that will give you that sharper, more defined look. Even when you don't have, say an outdoor scene or something like that, for the most part, I recommend always keeping this on. It's going to be the more accurate method of rendering. So, I mean, it's very rare that you should need to turn that off. Sharper texture filtering, what this does is, let me set up a quick example here. Let's apply a texture to our ground plane. So if we go to the texture tab here, apply this. Something's going on with my material. But anyways, if we look at the side of this cup, okay, when you view a texture at an extreme angle where all these details can sort of mush and blend together, imagine you're doing wood on the table or wood grain on a table. And imagine yourself eye level with that table. And all that wood grain texture and detail can kind of mush together. So when you have sharper texture filtering enabled, what KeyShot will do is try and preserve all that detail and crispness in the texture when you are viewing it at an extreme angle. So that's what sharper texture filtering does. And that's pretty much all the render settings.
Yeah, one more question. Why isn't the wine pouring out of the glass?
Why isn't the wine pouring out of the glass? We
have it positioned there?
We haven't incorporated physics into KeyShot just yet. So, when we get to the physics, we'll hopefully have the wine pouring out of the glass. So yeah, is that about it for questions?
Yeah,
or?
That'll about do it.
Okay. Well, hey, thanks everyone for attending. If you ever have any questions or have suggestions for webinars, you can send your suggestions to info@luxion.com. We're more than happy to do webinars on topics that you need reinforcing. And if you ever have any questions about how to create a certain material or what render settings to use or how to reduce your render time, you can always email us at support@luxion.com, and we're more than happy to help. So thanks again for attending, and we'll see you next time for the next webinar.